is that I always, okay, great, thanks. So we are recording, just so everybody knows, but welcome to our next installment of our Prairie Reconstruction Initiative webinar. So for those of you who are joining us and aren't necessarily aware of what the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is, I wanted to just give a brief overview. So we're basically, the mission is what it says at the top of the slide here, you know, a collaboration of individuals from multiple different organizations and agencies across kind of the upper Midwest who are really interested in learning about how to do prairie reconstruction better, so that we can learn faster and learn together. And we have a number of different ways that this network of people is working towards that. We have, some of you may be familiar, we've developed a database to try to pull information in so that we can start learning about reconstructions. We have a monitoring protocol we've developed for people to use. But one of the other ways that we are doing that as well is through hosting these webinars like this, where we can tap into researchers and or land managers or whoever who's got information that they're learning to share with the rest of the network about, so that we can all, you know, benefit from that shared learning and information. So today we have the pleasure of having Lars Brudvig join us from Michigan State University. And Lars is going to talk to us about work he's been doing on reconstructions up there in a number of different questions that his lab has been asking for the past few years. So I will let him introduce the research topics, and please take it away, Lars.
Great, thanks a lot, Marissa. So let's see, let me share my screen. How does that look?
Looks great.
And have we started the recording?
Thank you for asking. Yes, I did.
All right, well, thank you everybody for being here. I was just glancing quickly through the list of attendees, and it's wonderful to see you all, some familiar names and lots of new ones. So yeah, thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to come and talk to your group, who I've known about for a long time, but I don't think I've actually formally connected with before, about the work that we've been doing on planting year effects. And so I'll be talking about the causes and consequences of planting year effects during prairie reconstruction. And there we go. All right, so before I get started, I want to say thank you to a team of individuals who I've been working with for a little bit over 10 years now on this topic of prairie reconstruction, both in Michigan and surrounding states. And in particular on this topic of planting year effects, Anna Funk, who publishes under Anna Groves, has been really central and instrumental. And more recently, Chris Catano, who's a current postdoc with our group. Anna was a former graduate student with our group. Chris Catano is a current postdoc with our group, has been taking up some of these ideas within an experiment I'll talk about today. All right, so Paul was telling me that, well, folks in this group, of course, will be familiar with prairies and prairie reconstruction, but just in case there are some new folks, I want to spend just a few minutes kind of reminding us of why we're all here. And that is, of course, because prairies are these amazing ecosystems that were historically widespread, supported all kinds of fantastic plants and animals and other aspects of biological diversity. By some counts, we think there were maybe about 68 million hectares of tallgrass prairie in central North America a few hundred years ago. And of course, as I think we're all familiar with, much of that has been converted for human land uses, particularly agriculture, leaving just a small percentage of this historical range and virtually none of it remaining in the eastern portion of the tallgrass region. So at the same time, we've been seeing this additional interesting pattern. At the same time, we've been seeing conversion of ecosystems like prairies for agricultural lands. We've also been seeing the abandonment of agricultural lands. And this is, you know, for a variety of different reasons, including losses of fertility. But what this map shows is kind of a heat map of abandoned cropland as of the year 2000 in the United States, where redder colors are areas with more abandoned cropland. And we can see substantial areas across the historical prairie region, and particular areas in southern Michigan where we do a lot of our work, where crops or where areas were converted to cropland and that was subsequently abandoned. So herein lies this opportunity to reconstruct ecosystems like tallgrass prairies, but it doesn't happen on its own. When we abandon these croplands, we don't get prairies back. We get successional old fields that are filled with a variety of native and non-native, typically weedy plant species. And the reason is that prairies are really rare, and the seeds of prairie plants typically won't arrive on their own. And this is where this process of reconstruction comes in, which is, of course, seed-based restoration. Okay, so this is dramatically oversimplifying this rather complicated process of reconstructing prairies. But again, just so that we're all on the same page, we can start with a field that we want to reconstruct. It might be an old field. It might be coming straight from tillage agriculture. If it is an old field, we'll use herbicides typically and spray out this vegetation. We'll add the seeds. This could be through broadcast seeding, using a seed drill like we see here. Over time, these prairie plants that are seeded establish and hopefully come to dominate this community. And at that point, we can reintroduce other important aspects of the system, including faunal components and key disturbances like prescribed fire. So again, this is a dramatic oversimplification of this process, but again, just to kind of remind us of how we go about this process of prairie reconstruction. Now, what's fascinating is we can follow this same general process time and time again, and we never get the same result twice. And just in pictures, we can see some of the variation in tallgrass prairie reconstruction efforts, all these coming from southwestern Michigan, where we do a lot of our research, ranging from heavily forb dominated, in some cases with a clear diversity of forbs, a diversity of colors at least, like in the upper left. And then in the bottom right, we see a warm season grass dominated reconstruction. So lots of variety. Some we would probably class more as successful in terms of being a prairie reconstruction than others. Some are what we would, I think, probably safely say are not successful, like this prairie reconstruction, which has become dominated by the invasive species spotted knapweed. So really set of important questions that are driving research in our research group at Michigan State are, first of all, why do these outcomes vary? Why can we do the same general process of reconstruction and get such a wide variety of outcomes? Can we unpack some of the reasons for this variation that then can help inform this process of reconstruction and ultimately maybe lead to predictive capacity, where we might be able to confidently say, this is how this prairie will look in 2 years in the future, 5 years in the future, or maybe even from the outset before any reconstruction activities start. This is the ways that this prairie might turn out. So these are some of our goals, some of our guiding questions. And then I think it's helpful then to ask ourselves, well, what might we expect? Why might prairie reconstructions vary in their outcomes? And it's a really, really long list. We've explored a number of different attributes of reconstructed prairies and evaluated the ways that they may be important for things like plant community composition and diversity and other aspects of prairies. We can kind of maybe break these up into 4 general classes. Aspects of the local site, things like soils, how big it is, how shady it is from surrounding trees, the sort of landscape it sits in, the habitats that surround a particular reconstructed prairie, attributes of the management. This is, again, a long list, but certainly attributes of the seed mix, how many species are sown, the density of the seed mix, and then post-seeding management that might involve things like prescribed fire and other tools can be important. And then also what I would call like aspects of the history of the site, what the land use was prior to reconstruction efforts, how long it's been since reconstruction started, and then the conditions from the planting year. So that'll be the focus of what I want to talk about today. And I think this is this really fascinating idea that even many years later, the conditions at the onset of a reconstruction project might be consequential. So how might that work? Okay, so the idea behind these planting year effects is that, again, environmental conditions during the planting year may have these long-lasting consequences for a reconstruction. And the logic behind this is that environmental conditions vary from year to year. Now, one condition that we commonly point to as causing planting year effects is rainfall, but I'll consider in a little bit some additional sort of conditions or factors that might vary from year to year. So these environmental conditions can vary. We know from a long history of research in ecology that different environmental factors favor different species. And because of that, we might have different species favored in different planting years, again, because the environmental conditions differ. And so some species may establish, other species might not establish, and that might then shape the trajectory of the reconstruction, either because those species persist or because they may influence things like additional species that are able or not able to establish. So the key point then is that these environmental conditions at the onset may have long-lasting influence on the way that a reconstruction sort of bears out. Now, what I think is really fascinating about this is that this suggests that we could essentially, do a thought experiment here and say we could restore or reconstruct a single site twice over in exactly the same way and maybe not get the same result. In fact, we might get a substantially different result because the conditions may vary in one year over another. So I think this is a really fascinating idea from the perspective of being an ecological researcher. I think it's also a really important consideration because, if these planting year effects are important for the ways that prairie reconstructions are turning out, this may help us understand some of this variation that's happening, that's shifting this balance, along this sort of like success and failure continuum. It's also a really challenging thing. And I know from talking with practitioners that planting year effects are commonly cited as a cause of variation in reconstruction outcomes. It's a complicated and challenging thing to study, though, for at least a couple of reasons. So first of all, the first challenge is that every year is unique, and not just in one way, but in many, many ways. And again, we often think about planting year effects through the lens of rainfall, but I think it's important to recognize that weather conditions vary in a lot of ways besides how much it rains from one year to the next. We may have differences in temperature. We may have differences in growing season frosts. We may have differences in droughts, in heat waves, and in all kinds of other aspects of the weather. So kind of disentangling these can be challenging. And it might also be more than just the weather. Other aspects of ecological systems might be different from year to year. Things like the abundance of consumers like herbivores or granivores, seed-eating animals, or fungal pathogens. I realize this is not a fungal pathogen, but it's just a representation of a fungus that reminds me to talk about fungal pathogens. May differ from year to year, and that may cause more or less seed death from seeds that are sown during a reconstruction, more or less seedling death after seeds emerge. Now, these may be driven by weather or not. The same goes for the weedy species, those species that are not sown as part of a reconstruction. Their abundance and their identity may vary from year to year because of the ways that environmental triggers express species out of the seed bank and how many of those seeds come out of a seed bank at the onset of a reconstruction effort. So, this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but hopefully you get the point that environmental conditions can vary in many, many different ways from year to year. And I think understanding the reasons for planting year effects is, both interesting from an ecology perspective, but also potentially really important if we're to layer aspects of management onto the reconstruction process to try to mitigate undesirable planting year effects. Certainly, we might do something different if a planting year effect is caused by rainfall compared to weed pressure, for example. A second challenge is that every site is unique, and this is also in many ways. I've talked about some of this already earlier on in thinking about the ways that the reasons for variation in reconstruction outcomes. But reconstructed prairies differ again in their soils, landscape context, aspects of the seed mix, their fire history, their age, and the list really kind of goes on and on and on. And this is a challenge for the study of planting year effects because what it means is that we can't simply compare two different sites that were planted in different years and get a strong insight into whether planting year effects are at play, because those two sites may differ in their planting year and many, many other reasons. And it might be some of these other reasons that are causing the differences between two sites, either alone or in conjunction with planting year effects. All right, so these are challenging issues and issues that we've been grappling with an experiment that I'll talk about in a little bit. But first, I want to kind of introduce several research questions that have been driving this line of research with our group. Okay, so first of all, we want to know, do we see a signature of year effects or planting year effects on planted prairies? And this sort of backs us way up and says, okay, well, let's approach this and ask, do we see these in the first place? If we do, what are the reasons why? What are the mechanisms that contribute to these planting year effects? Is it all about rainfall, or are some of these other factors potentially important as well? Or alternatively? And then finally, what are the consequences of planting year effects for these restoration or reconstruction outcomes for things like native plant diversity, invasion, or other aspects of ecosystem structure and functioning? You know, the sorts of things that we might evaluate reconstruction outcomes based on. So from here, I'm going to go through three parts of this presentation that relate to three different sort of arms of this research within our group. And the first is an experimental test of planting year effects. And this was research that was initiated by Anna Funk during her PhD work. And this is a really neat and clever experiment that Anna started. So she said, again, we have this problem of conflating year and site while studying year effects. It's not so simple as just comparing two different sites that were planted in different years. So let's control for the site. We'll work within a single site, and we will assign a set of plots different planting years. So she did exactly that. She set up and delineated 18 different plots within a single site that was very homogeneous in its environmental conditions, a level, sort of homogeneous successional old field. And what she did then was she repeated exactly the same reconstruction process in 3 different years, 3 different starting years, where the plots were randomly assigned 6 replicates each to being planted in 2014, 15, or 2016. And when I say controlled, I mean controlled, down to controlling the seeding rate for the same species, corrected for pure live seed estimates, all the way to planting these reconstructions within 2 calendar days of the same across 3 different years. The sites were prepped the same, they were seeded the same, and then they've gone through the same management sequence, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on over time. Okay, so this controlled for the site effect and allowed Anna to hone in on the planting year effect. She then said, well, what about rainfall? So rainfall is this sort of leading putative cause of planting year effects. So let's get at this directly. And to do that, she constructed Rainout shelters. In her paper, which I'll reference in a little bit, there are details of how to build these Rainout shelters. If anybody's curious, $100 each, the Anna Groves Rainout shelter design. And she installed these in the planting year over each of these reconstruction efforts. So they were only on for a few months during the year that the reconstruction was initiated by seed, and then they were taken off. And so it was a first year rainfall manipulation where underneath these, she manipulated rainfall at 3 levels, either to simulate the worst drought that this area in southwestern Michigan had seen in the last 30 years, an average amount of rainfall on a weekly basis, again, based off of 30-year local records, or a high level of rainfall. We initially wanted to do the highest level of rainfall, but we realized she would literally need like a semi truck of water delivered to the site every single week. So that idea was dismissed early on, and we went with a high level of rainfall. So the idea with this then was we'll control for rainfall under these rainout shelters and vary the planting year. And so with that, then the hypothesis was that if it's all about rainfall, plots planted in different years, but with the same rainfall regime should turn out relatively the same way. But alternatively, if plots that are planted in different years, but have the same rainfall regime kind of turn out differently, that would suggest that it's something else besides rainfall. Now, we wouldn't necessarily know what it was, but we at least know that something else, some other environmental factor besides the amount of rain hitting the ground is at play. So again, Anna repeated this process where the shelters were on the plots during their planting year, the first growing season, then they were taken off, cleaned, and reinstalled on the next year's plot. I'll also mention that she additionally manipulated the number of species sown into these plots. And the idea behind this was, well, we know that planting a high number of species is important during prairie reconstruction, and it's possible that that might mitigate planting year effects. So essentially, if we have adverse planting year conditions, something like a drought, planting more species may make it more likely that something will take. I mean, almost just by chance alone, or chance that we're able to get the species that has the right sort of adaptations for dealing with those adverse conditions. So our hypothesis was that maybe any adverse planting year effects that we might see could be mitigated by sowing a lot of species. I won't show any of those results because the bottom line is what we found was that plots sown with more species become more diverse. We already knew that in prairie reconstruction, but they did not mitigate planting year effects. So I'll focus now on these plots planted in different years, and with the different first year rainfall regimes. So within these plots, then Anna wanted to know about how these different conditions influenced the emergence of species that were either seeded or not seeded, and their survival. She initially focused just on the first planting year, and I'll show you some of those results. This is sort of what it looked like on the ground. This was really meticulous and amazing work that Anna did. She had set up these little plots delineated by some thin rope, and then she visited those repeatedly over the growing season. Again, that first planting year growing season, and using pins of different colors marked individual plants as they emerged to get rates of emergence. And then knowing, that a pin marked an individual, she could check to see whether or not it survived in later time periods. So what can we see from this? Well, we can see, first of all, there's a lot of weeds. This was a weedy field. And that'll come into play in a little bit, but we can also see some of these native species like Chamaecrista, Dahlia, and Penstemon popping up as well. Okay, so let's see some of what Anna learned in this experiment. So first of all, what we learned is, maybe not too surprisingly, plants like water. And as we go from drought conditions to non-drought conditions, we see greater emergence. I'm going to focus on emergence because that's where the action was. Survival was incredibly high in this experiment. And so differences in seedling numbers across plots were a consequence of variation in emergence. So we're looking first at the sown species, those species that were sown as part of the reconstruction process. And what we see is that when we go from drought to non-drought conditions, we see an increase in the number of individual plants that emerge out of plots. This is averaged across all three of the planting years. When we look now at non-sown species, we can see a couple of things. First of all, again, there were a lot of non-sown individuals in this experiment. Secondly, they respond more strongly to the watering treatment. And whereas with the sown species, when we go from average water to high watering, we don't really see any differences. We see that these non-sown species can respond to these very high, kind of like deluge amounts of simulated precipitation. So what this kind of suggested to us that these weedy non-sown species are sort of like super responders to elevated rainfall. And this is a theme that will kind of play out through multiple aspects of our research. So this is now breaking those results down by year. We're looking now at the sown species, and on the x-axis we see here low amounts of simulated rainfall in the planting year. What we notice is that the patterns are relatively similar across years. But when we start to look at average and high levels of rainfall, what we notice is that differences among years start to emerge. So what this suggests is that when we're in an extreme drought, it's all about water. The plants are very stressed, very few plants are emerging, and other factors just don't matter so much. But once the plants start to get enough rainfall where emergence is a regular phenomenon, then something else, again, we don't know what else, but something else can become important. And what we see, for example, in this best planting year, again, we don't know why, but in this best planting year, for the sown species at least, 2015, there's about twice as much emergence as in the other 2 years. Again, but only when we're not in an extreme drought. So let's look now at the non-sown species. You again see a similar pattern under drought conditions, the low watering treatment. But when we start to increase the watering to average and high levels, we again see these other factors start to emerge as important. Again, these are plots that were watered exactly the same, but in different years, we start to see different amounts of emergence. Something that's interesting here, though, is that the good year, 2015, for the sown species, wasn't necessarily a good year for the weedy species. So the sown species and the weedy species seem to be doing something different, both with respect to how much they can respond to elevated rainfall, but also in which years they're emerging the most after planting it out of the seed bank. And we can see some of this variation when we look at individual species. So I won't go through all these results in detail, but these are some of the more common species in our system, non-sown along the top row, sown species along the bottom row. And what we can see is just a ton of variation here, where some species like witchgrass and smooth crabgrass are showing a lot of variation, both with respect to the watering treatment and across the years, the different color bars, again, in these graphs. Other species are showing differences across years, but very little response across the watering treatments, like purple coneflower. And other species yet are showing variation with respect are showing relatively little variation in general across years and across watering treatments, with the exception of a single watering by year combination. Spotted knapweed would be a good example, where it's sort of emerging at the rates it's emerging, and it doesn't seem to matter too much how much water we're throwing on the plots or which year we're repeating the process in. So lots of variation with respect to rainfall and other planting conditions. And as a result, we're seeing that the communities are differing, again, with respect to rainfall and planting year. I'm just showing the planting years here. And for those unfamiliar with these, this is an ordination. So what this is representing is the identities and abundances of the plant species in different plots, where the plots are points on this graph. And the way to interpret this is that plots or points close to each other represent plots that had very similar plant species in them. And points further apart represent plots that had different plant species and abundances within them. So what we can see is that planting year mattered for the composition of these reconstructed communities at the end of their first year. And in particular, there's one year that seems to be doing maybe something different from the others, and that's 2016. So keep that year in mind. It'll come back up later, but 2016 seems to have something different going on in terms of which species and how much of them are showing up by the end of the first year. So what did this teach us then? So what this taught us was that these planting year conditions can affect initial establishment of both the sown and the non-sown species during prairie reconstruction. Rainfall is important. We see effects of the watering treatment for both groups, but it's really only part of the story. And across these different measures that we looked at, the abundance, the richness, and the identities of different species, we typically saw about as much variation explained by the watering treatment as we saw unexplained by the watering treatment within a given year. So what that means then again is that there's something else or some things else about the environment that are varying from year to year within these plots. We don't really know what. It's fun to think about, but we don't ultimately know what was different across the years. But that, in addition to variation in simulated rainfall, is driving the emergence and establishment of plants. We see that these sown and non-sown species respond to differently to water and other factors. Again, these weeds are like super responders to elevated rainfall. And they also seem to be responding to different factors in different years. Again, 2015 was a good sown species year, and maybe 2016 was a better year for the weedy species. And because of this, these first year plant communities differ in their composition from one planting year to the next to the next. So what this did then was convince us, okay, we have really sound experimental evidence that planting year factors, including rainfall and other things, can have consequence for the initial establishment of these prairie communities. So it answered some of our questions, but it left us with a lot more, maybe more than what we started with. So we wanted to know, does this actually matter when we go out into, what we kind of call real prairie reconstructions? These prairies that we started out with pictures of. If we were to go out to some of these prairies, can we see a signature of planting year conditions? Is it related to rainfall? Do these effects persist over time as prairies get older, or do they fade over time? Maybe they're important initially, but after 3, 4, 5 years, that initial planting year weather is just sort of ancient history, and other things like competitive dynamics become much more important. And how do these planting year effects compare relative to other things that we know are important drivers of prairie reconstruction outcomes? Things like the number of species sown, aspects of the soils at particular sites, how old the site is, again, how often prescribed fire is administered, things like that. So kind of putting it in context. So to get at some of these questions, we did a survey of 83 reconstructed prairies. These sites spanned 3 different states in southwestern Michigan at the Kankakee Sands Nature Conservancy site in northern Indiana and McHenry County in Illinois. We visited each of these sites and we sampled plants and soils. Some of the results I'll show you are from a 1/10 hectare, 20 by 50 meter plot in the very middle, approximate middle of each site. We were able to work with the practitioners at each site to determine details of the seed mix, which species were seeded, how many species, the seeding rate at each site, and the history of fire across each of the sites. And then we use this PRISM data set, which is an interpolated data set from weather stations that gives you insights into the weather conditions at a particular point on a map. So we did this for each of these reconstructed prairies from their planting year. Now the sites ranged from 2 to 19 years old. So coupling that with this span of geography that we looked across, there was actually incredible variation in the planting year weather conditions. We looked at this from a lot of different perspectives, including how much it rained, when it rained, how long droughts were, how hot it was or cold, things like heat waves. And then we also looked at growing degree days, which sort of told us about how warmth kind of accumulates over the course of the growing season. This can be important for plant phenology, among other things. There's a lot of variables, and we boiled this down into 3 different, what we call principal components analyses. The details aren't so important, but what is important is that the first of these axes in this analysis described how hot it was during the planting year. The second described how rainy it was, and the third described how droughty it was. So it turned out that it was that second axis of the weather principal component analysis that was important, how much it rained. And that determined the diversity of plants and the abundance of plants, but maybe not in the way that you might expect. So what we found was that as planting years became rainier, the right side of this graph, they became weedier. So the reconstructions that had more rainfall during their planting years had a greater diversity of non-sown species, and we saw a very similar pattern for cover of non-sown species. We see the opposite pattern for the diversity or richness of the sown species, where the rainier years were less diverse in terms of prairie species. And these are analyses that are controlling for things like how many species were sown into the sites, soils, fire, and so on. So I'll be the first to admit that these are messy relationships. They don't explain a majority of the variation in things like species richness, but I think they're also highly intriguing. They're really interesting to think about. How could rainfall cause prairie plants to establish more poorly? And I think it goes back to these experimental results that Anna had, where these weedy plant species, again, are kind of super responders to rain. And so in her experiment, she found that the seeded species benefit from elevated rainfall, but the weedy species really, really, really benefited. And so I think what's happening here is that when prairies are initiated during wet years, they become weedier, and those weeds then subsequently suppress the prairie plants. So what that means then is that the drier years that become less weedy are in fact actually better for the reconstruction, at least in these sites that we looked at. We see additional evidence of that when we look at what the dissimilarity between the seed mix and the vegetation. So what this shows us is that in rainier years, again, the right side of this graph, the plant community that we observed at the site more poorly matched the seed mix that was sown onto the sites in terms of the identities of the species. And again, it was those prairies planted in drier years that had a better concordance between the seed mix and the plant community that subsequently developed. So what does this show us? This shows us that there's at least some evidence for a lasting signature of planting year rainfall in reconstructed prairies. Again, we think that this is being driven by these weedy plant species who love rain and are really responsive to high levels of rainfall. And while I didn't get into these results, I'd also mention that these effects were large compared to other known drivers like seed mix richness and density, soil attributes, and fire frequency, at least for the weedy species. And they also don't fade over time. We didn't see any evidence that these effects of planting year rainfall were different for the oldest sites compared to the youngest sites. Okay, so I think intriguing results and suggest again that there can be these persistent planting year effects during reconstruction. We then wanted to come back to our experiment and ask, about some of these same questions. Do these effects persist over time? And in what ways do they matter for some things that we might care about during prairie reconstruction efforts? How diverse the plantings are, and various aspects to how they function. So this brought us back to our prairie reconstruction planting year experiment that Anna started for her PhD. And Chris Catano, who's again a postdoc with our group, has then followed up, not in the rainfall plots, but just in the large plots as a whole that were planted in different years. And he wants to know how planting year can sort of modify relationships between the plant diversity and the ways that the plots function. So let's fast forward a few years. I mentioned before that we have maintained these plots. We've done this on a schedule with respect to when they were planted. So they were planted in whatever year they were mowed for 2 years after that. We allowed them to build up biomass, then they were burned. And that's all happened in sequence. We're going to burn the plots again this coming spring. And so the plots are now 5 to 7 growing seasons in, about to go to 6 to 8 growing seasons within a few months. I just wanted to show you some pictures of what they look like. So I think these pictures are just striking. So what we're looking at on the left is a boundary between 2 different plots, one planted in 2014 and one planted in 2016. And hopefully you can see with your eyes where that boundary is. On the right, we're looking through a 2016 planting with a 2014 planting in the distance. So what do we notice? Well, first of all, there's really different structures to these plots. We see a lot of warm season grass dominance on the left of the left image. Let's see if I can get my mouse to work over here. And on the right, we see almost no warm season grasses at all. Instead, we see a lot of forb cover. And in fact, this is a lot of spotted knapweed, Queen Anne's lace, mostly weedy species that are showing here. And we see some of these differences reflected in the data when we look at these plots. The plots differ in the number of species depending on their planting year. And in fact, we see that the 2016 plots have the most species. The 2014 plots, the fewest species. This also brings up another challenge, which I haven't got to yet with studying year effects, and that's that we also know that the age of the plantings can be really important in prairie reconstruction. So that raises the question here, are the 2016 plots different because they're younger or because they were planted in 2016 per se? This might be challenging for something like species richness, where we know this general pattern in prairie reconstructions of a decline in richness with time, at least for reconstructions that are seeded only once at the initiation. So to help get around this, we and Chris have surveyed these plots in 2 consecutive years. And the idea is if we see the same patterns across years, that would be evidence that it is about the planting year per se and not necessarily about the age. So I should mention that 2020 was a mild drought year. So we see a suppression in richness overall, but in spite of that, we still see the 2016 plots with elevated species richness relative to the other 2 planting years. I should have also mentioned these are early results. Actually, Chris just sent me these figures last week, so you're actually the first to see them. And I also need to provide that caveat that we always need to provide with preliminary results, that these may change before the end, but I think that they're pretty interesting. So looking now at community composition, this is another one of these ordination plots, where we're looking at all these different plots that Chris sampled out in the field across these different plantings in 2 different years. So these are organized left to right from 2016 through 2014. So what is the first thing we see? We see there's 3 sort of clouds of points where the different planting years are separate from each other. Now, again, this might be because the planting year mattered for the community composition of plants, might be because they're of different ages. So again, Chris sampled across 2 different years, and we can look at the data both different ways. This is showing the data in terms of the planting year. We can now look at the data in terms of the sampling year. And we can also see here that sampling year matters for community composition. Again, this might be because one year was a mild drought year and the other year wasn't. Could be because of general successional dynamics within these plots that are happening over time. But what's important here is that as we go from the 2019 survey to the 2020 survey, the plots are sort of moving generally upwards in ordination space, but along different tracks, where the 2016 plots are tracking a different track than the 2015 plots, and to a degree, the 2014 plots. So what this suggests to us then is that planting year it seems to be mattering for this trajectory of the ways that these reconstructed prairies are assembling over time. So Chris then wanted to know about the ways that they're functioning. And the ultimate goal here is to connect these relationships between the plant diversity and the attributes of ecosystem functioning within these plots, and understand how those are modified by the planting year. We haven't done that yet, but I want to show you some of these results about the ways that these reconstructed plots are functioning. Chris and Aiden Pace, who is an undergraduate with our group, went out to these plots and surveyed them for 4 different, what we call ecosystem functions. They surveyed for floral resource production as an indicator of pollinator resources, cover by showy insect pollinated plants. They clipped plots and calculated dry biomass as a measure of productivity. They measured rates of decomposition. So coupling that with above ground biomass tells us important sort of carbon in, carbon out within the system. And then they measured a trophic interaction, seed predation. That's what we see Aiden doing here in seed trays, where he deployed these trays with counted numbers of seeds and then came back a few weeks later to see how many were removed by granivores. We don't have all these results worked up yet, but I want to show you some of the results related to pollinator resources and above ground biomass. So we're looking first at above ground biomass, and what we see is that the planting year seems to matter for how productive these plots are. And in particular, the plots planted in 2016 and maybe to an extent 2015 have lower biomass production. We again have this challenge of the plots being different ages, but what we can see is the same general ordering of the biomass production across the 3 planting years in 2019 and 2020, which suggests to us that planting year may be important here for how productive these plots are. We see something very similar, but kind of a mirror image when we look at the floral resource production in these plots. The cover by showy insect pollinated flowers, where 2014, the year where the plots were the most productive in terms of biomass, have the least cover by floral resources, whereas 2016, the least productive plots have the most floral resource production. And when we put these 2 side by side, we can really sort of see this trade-off that seems to be emerging, which I think makes sense, where we have a trade-off between insect pollinated forbs and competitively superior C4 grasses, which make a lot of biomass. But what's interesting here is that relationship seems to be mediated by the planting year, where whether you're getting a C4 productive plot or an essentially weedy but high floral resource producing plot depends on which year that plot was planted in, holding everything else about the reconstruction process constant. Okay, so summarizing this, what do we see? We see a fairly persistent 5 to 7 year planting year effect that was all derived from this rigorous controlled experiment that's led to differences in species richness and composition of plants, and seems to be influencing at least some ecosystem functions, but in differing ways. And in particular, again, we see these different patterns for biomass and floral resource production in a way that seems to be a trade-off. Okay, so let's circle back around to some of these questions that we started off with. Do we see a signature of year effects in planted prairies? I think that based off of these 3 lines of research, I'm convincing myself at least that that answer is yes, and that precipitation seems to be an important driver of planting year effects, but it's not the only one. And again, we don't know at this point what some of these other contributors to planting year effects are, but what seems clear to me is that it's not only about precipitation. And this has consequence for, I think, things that we ultimately really care about in prairie reconstruction: how diverse the communities are, how dominated they are by the seeded species, and conversely, how invaded they are by weedy species, and the ways that they function for things that may be important ecologically, or important also for additional aspects that we want to promote for from these communities, like pollinating insects. So I'll just wrap up by thinking a little bit about what we can do about all this. And I wanted to wrap up with this because I want to hear what thoughts may come from the group, what questions you may have, of course, on any front, but particularly here. I think this is a challenging issue, grappling with year effects. Again, they seem to be important contributors to variation among reconstruction efforts and relative success in those reconstruction efforts. So it seems like something that we might want to gear management resources at, but what can we do exactly? Well, it seems like perhaps it might be useful to invest extra in weed control efforts during rainy planting years. If we know that it's raining a lot, perhaps there might be opportunities to just get ready on the weed control front, because at least for the sites we've studied, it seems like it's coming. We might want to emphasize more interseeding after rainy planting years. After that challenge of the weeds may have passed, which again can suppress the diversity of planting species, maybe those are at least some instances where we might want to make this investment in interseeding to bring the diversity of the planted species back up. Certainly this is, I think, strong motivation for sound field prep to deplete the seed bank where I think the majority of these weedy plant species are coming from. I think it's curious to think about whether we can anticipate good planting years. And I realize it's a really complicated issue on a lot of fronts, ranging from the relative flexibility or inflexibility to shift resources depending on what weather conditions might be looking like in a particular year, and also the ability to even know that in the first place. But I think as some of these anticipatory climate models become better and better, this may start to become more and more of a possibility. And then again, we didn't see any evidence either in Anna's experiment or out in the 83 reconstructed prairies that more diverse plantings mediated planting year effects. But of course, there are lots of other benefits to diverse plantings during prairie reconstruction. So that seems like a good idea all around. So with that, I will wrap up, leave you with a picture of a reconstructed prairie that I like to spend time in, and see what questions you have. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Lars. I'll do my clapping hands here in the virtual world.
So would it be all right if I stop sharing my screen so I could see people's faces more easily, or what would you prefer?
No, yeah, that'd be great. Stopping sharing is great. And your last slide of what can we do about all this was exactly the question I was going to ask you. So I'm curious to hear what others have to say. So please, people, put your questions in the chat. If people have, if you want to ask your question yourself, just put an R in the chat and we'll just kind of go through in order here. We do have an initial question here. It says, what would the graphs look like if you plotted years since planting rather than calendar year. So in other words, compare the planting years when they're all 2 years old or 3 years old, sort of, et cetera.
Yeah, and we've done exactly that with Anna's experiment. I don't remember all the details of what they look like off the top of my head, but because of that challenge where different planting years are different ages, we've looked at it both ways. Where I was showing the data today based off of planting year, but we've also realigned all the data so that they're all with respect to time since planting. And the idea then was that if we, if the patterns we're seeing based off of planting year all sort of go away when we line them up based off of the time since planting, then that would suggest it's all about age, and not about planting year conditions per se. In Anna's experiment, that's mostly not what we've seen. And we've seen differences among planting years, even when we standardize them for how old they are.
Okay, cool. So next question is, do you think the lack of response to rainfall in the planted species might be partly a competitive effect with the non-planted species?
Yeah, I think so. I think it could be in part that, and I think that's a really good point. Just to rephrase it, when we simulate or observe really heavy rainfall seasons and the weed pressure is super intense, there could be a competitive suppression of the planted species, which, of course, invest a lot below ground initially and can very easily get overtopped. I also wonder if it's just something about gross differences in the life history strategies between these weedy, annual, often, or at least fast growing non-planted species, which sort of are adapted to be able to take advantage of resource pulses. They seed bank, they're good dispersers. Their gig is sort of like being there when the conditions are good and taking advantage of that. Whereas these prairie plants are sort of more in it for the long haul, where they take the good with the bad and sort of deal with it. And they're better at, dealing with stressful conditions. And because of that, given these sort of like trade-offs between ability to exploit resources and deal with stress that we know are true in plant ecology, they may just sort of not be, the prairie plant species might not be like hardwired to be able to deal with high resource conditions like rainy years.
Yeah, sort of the short-term plasticity, I guess, or response. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but so also a question here about the weeds. So can you further define what the weeds were? Were they annuals, biennial, perennial?
Yeah, some of all of the above. Yeah, I showed some pictures of them, at least in Anna's experiment. Witchgrass was a big one. Spotted knapweed has been a big one. Interestingly, some of these weedy species, both because they're annuals and they're poor competitors in the long run, have largely dropped out of the system. But in spite of that, we're seeing these persistent differences in the diversity and composition. So what that suggests is that some of these weedy species that drive these first year plant community differences may not even be part of the community later on when we're seeing these persistent differences. So they're sort of almost like setting the system on a different track, so to speak, in ways that I don't know, we still have work to sort out, but I think that's an interesting possibility.
So almost like some of these annual things might be hindering some things from germinating initially that then just don't show up in the plant community because they couldn't germinate initially? Or do you see things that like didn't germinate initially and then they'll show up later?
Yeah, that's a good question. Anna looked at that a little bit. So I showed you that picture with all the little sewing pins in the ground. She didn't leave those out over the winter because we didn't want to deal with a bunch of pins getting ejected by frost heave and then being bad news for us and others later on. But she had counted all the individuals and noted all the species in those plots. And she came back a subsequent year to see if new species had shown up or if those numbers were, changed dramatically. The answer that she found was that there were some novel species showing up in plots that clearly had emerged during the second year after planting. But at least in our plots, the majority of of individuals or species, at least, that we saw in plots were in those plots the first planting year.
Cool. So another comment here, anecdotally, they've seen the effects of moisture on prairie reconstructions, but not only in the amount of rainfall, but also by sort of elevation changes across the site.
Yeah, so like soil mediated moisture differences, it might relate to sandiness or something like that. Yeah, that's a really neat idea. So we looked at that in Anna's scientific reports paper. We asked if there was any relation, if there were, essentially interactions between how well the soils held water at the sites and the first year rainfall, where we sort of hypothesized that those planting year rainfall effects might be most extreme when they lined up with the soil droughtiness. So for example, if it was a drought year and it was a sandy site, then that might be the most extreme planting year effects.
Yeah.
We didn't see any evidence of that, but before we learned that, we actually started a new experiment, which it replicates aspects of Anna's experiment, but repeats it on a site with heavier soils and a site with sandier soils. That's still running right now, and I don't know those answers for you today, but that's the idea there, that maybe these planting year effects may be contingent on the type of soil that underlies the site.
Yeah, water holding capacities.
Exactly.
So next question is, have you explored or seen any community trait changes that were related to different plant communities found from different planting years?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that Chris is going to be looking at. We have built a database of plant functional traits for this community, and I've looked at it, in different reconstructions, but we haven't done it yet in the year effects experiment. That's something that Chris is going to be doing and asking, essentially if sites or plots that started off in a drought may have different sorts of traits represented in the community compared to sites or plots that started off, with enough rainfall.
Yeah.
Good question.
Cool. So we have another question. We're getting close to the end of our time. I just want to make one announcement. Amanda did put at the top of the chat for anybody the link to our Prairie Reconstruction Initiative website. So if you want to know more about the group, or you want to join our email list to get announcements for all the great webinars, go to that website. And maybe Amanda, you just want to put it in again for anybody who wasn't on when you put it in the chat initially. But we do have one more question here. So with spotted knapweed being allelopathic, I'm not surprised to see it dominate the 2016 plots. More mowings per year would suppress seed production.
Yeah, and I mentioned this only very briefly, but as part of the management, these plots were all mowed kind of mid-growing season during the planting year and the second year. What's interesting is that there was a lot of spotted knapweed in all the plots early on. I think there's just a lot of it at this site in the seed bank, but it's mostly dropped out in the 2014 and 15 planting years, and that only took a few years, and it's been persistent in the 2016 planting. Again, I have absolutely no idea why that is, but it's just such a curious pattern. Like there's something different going on in spite of it being in the same field for those plots planted in 2016.
And randomly assigned, right? Yeah.
It's all randomly assigned, but I agree. Yeah, more mowing could help with that over time.
Yeah. So any other questions? It looks like not. The link to the PRI website is in the chat. Oh, one more question and then we'll go. So was there any treatment or preparation prior to planting?
Yeah, at this site, we did mowing and herbicide preparation, and then the soil was sort of lightly disked right before planting to expose mineral soil. That same process was repeated in advance of each of the plantings, but right before. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lars. This is really cool stuff. And yeah, adds a lot to our knowledge about what we're doing. Of course, how do we start to predict the weather, right? That's the question. But at least that, it gives us, more information to work with and knowledge about what's going to be impacting what's coming. So yeah, great great work. I appreciate it, and it's cool to hear about. So thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. Good to see everybody here. Good to make the connections. And
Yeah.
if you'd like to follow up with me, send me an email. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Great. Well, thanks everybody, and I hope everyone has a good afternoon. We'll be posting the recording if you know people who missed it and really want to watch. So that will be on the website as well. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks, everyone.